This is Chris Garcia coming at you live. Google on Air Hangouts. I got Bo on my phone. Woo, there's Bo from Australia, and look at that in his robe. You can get those in Australia. If you hear the music, that's because we're going to be playing Joel Richardson's Understanding the Times for you. 2 videos. I'm going to be I'm going to be showing you just 2 parts from this 4-part video, showing you the last 2. You can get, if you want it, you can get it. Understanding the Times. Go to joelrichardson.com. I believe this is the first one he did. It's very good. Everybody should see it, and that's why I'm posting it. So if you're just coming by, I encourage you to watch it. I will go ahead and get that started for you right now. Well, check and see if it's coming on for me if you can.
So session 3 and session 4, we're going to take the next 2 sessions. I think it was impossible to deal with this issue in an hour. We're going to take the next 2 sessions and devote it to identifying the great harlot. This is a subject that I've been slightly hesitant to teach on publicly because in the greater picture of what I've been teaching on and articulating, which I call the Islamic or the Middle Eastern end time paradigm, this is sort of the final doctrine that a lot of people wonder about. And I think that when I initially present it and suggest it to people just in discussion, I think that people have a real hard time sort of wrapping their head around it. But I believe that after walking through all of the information that I have here, I think that it will be at least understood why I hold to this position. Now, to be clear, I'm articulating my theory. I'm articulating my understanding, and this is one of the peripheral doctrines regarding the end times, and I don't claim any absolute understanding, but after wrestling and praying and thinking through these things for some years now, I really believe that the interpretation and the identification of the great harlot, Mystery Babylon, is in keeping with what the Bible is pointing us to. So, session 3, identifying the great harlot, this becomes fairly difficult to introduce you all to. Essentially, this revelation that finds itself in primarily in Revelation 17 and 18, it begins with a prophecy in Daniel 7, and that prophecy is regarding 4 gruesome beasts. But these beasts are symbols, they're apocalyptic symbols that are used to portray 4 world empires. And then later in Revelation 13, that same motif is picked up, this motif of a beast as an empire, and then later it's picked up again in Revelation 17. So the Bible is progressive revelation. It offers us progressive revelation. It begins with some information, and then it adds to and expands on that information. And so this great harlot is a woman that by the time that we get to Revelation 17 is portrayed as sitting on and riding this beast. And so it's all fairly complicated, but in brief, the beast represents the final world empire that is in essence the competitor or the enemy of the people of God in the earth. It is the satanic empire that will be the vehicle of the Antichrist and his armies. And so we have this woman that is portrayed as riding on the beast. They are rider and steed. Okay, they go together. This is essential. This is the Lone Ranger and Silver. Okay, they're a team. It's the great harlot and the beast. That's how the Bible portrays them. Next slide. Our information concerning the harlot, or mystery Babylon. These are primarily found in just a few key passages. As I just mentioned, Revelation 17 and 18 is where we have the fullest and most complete revelation of the woman. But again, and I make this point over and over again, the book of Revelation is a book that is thoroughly founded on previous revelation. It is the prophetic, poetic crescendo. It's a symphony of all of the prophetic passages throughout the Old Testament. And so when we're introduced to this woman, we have to understand that she does find her foundation in previous revelation. And some of those specific revelations are found in Isaiah 15, as well as Jeremiah 50. And then we're going to look in some detail at a verse in 1 Peter 5:13. But these revelations concerning the harlot in Isaiah 15 and Jeremiah, these are passages which have both historical as well as ultimate end-time fulfillment. So there was an entity in history known as Babylon, and these prophets were speaking to that entity, but again, they were prophesying through these historical realities and entities and speaking to this entity at the end of the age that we're going to talk about today, that the Bible calls the great harlot, the great whore, the mystery Babylon. So next slide. What we're going to do in this first session is we're going to examine the scriptural descriptions of the harlot, because there have been various interpretations and ideas offered by various believers down through history and throughout the church regarding the identity of this entity known as the great harlot. And I believe it's essential, again, being people who understand the times, who understand what this book, what the Bible is pointing us to. I believe that it's important that we understand these things in order that we can truly understand the times, understand the world that we live in, and all of the ramifications that come with that. But I believe it's essential that as we try to identify this woman, we walk through the various scriptural criteria, the various scriptural descriptions of the woman, and here's the key, is that whatever entity we arrive at and determine and examine as the fulfillment of this fairly mysterious prophecy, she needs to meet all of the scriptural criteria, because some of the various ideas that have been suggested, they line up pretty strongly with a few of the descriptions, but then a few others they don't. Again, in order to fulfill the biblical criteria, it needs to line up with all of the biblical descriptions, not just a few. So next slide. The first biblical description that we're given is that this entity, this woman that is portrayed as riding on the beast, and the beast is rising up out of the sea, is that she lives in a desert. This entity exists, specifically exists geographically in a literal desert. Revelation 17, verses 1 through 3. We'll actually read these verses a few times. Come, this is an angel. The angel is speaking to the Apostle John, the author of the book of Revelation, and John's having all of these visionary and spiritual experiences, and there's a sort of an angelic guide that is guiding him through all of this. And the angel says, "Come, I will show you the judgment that is about to come upon the great harlot who sits on many waters." Consistently throughout the Bible, this motif of waters is a reference to peoples and groups of peoples, tongues, tribes, and nations. She sits on many peoples with whom the kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So, and here's the key, the angel carried me away in the spirit into the desert, and I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast. Next slide. Now the King James translates that rather than desert as wilderness. And here's what needs to be understood, is that first of all, in the Strongs, in the lexicon, in the Greek, the word there is eremos or eramon. And what it refers to is a solitary, lonely, desolated wasteland, an uninhabited place. But again, this is the context of these passages is the land of Israel. And in that region, someplace that was desolate, it was always the desert. This reference of eremos in that context was always desert. And the reason that I want to highlight this Next slide is because oftentimes we hear the word wilderness and we think sort of like the Northwest Territories, like Sarah Palin's backyard. Okay, we think Alaska, you know, the great northern wilderness. And yeah, those places are by and large desolate, but in the context of the Bible, that phrase, eremos, is referring specifically to a deserted desert place. When Jesus went out and did his fast at the beginning of his ministry, he went out into the desert. You know, it was not out into a forest. Okay, it's not that there are not places with trees in the land of Israel, and particularly when you get up into Lebanon and so forth, but this reference biblically is literally to a desert. And this is important because the woman is portrayed in a desert. This is not just sort of an irrelevant fact that we can overlook. He says, come, I will show you the woman, and there she is sitting in a desert. Next slide. And this is really essential, it's foundational because it's repeated multiple times. She is royalty. She is portrayed as a queen. Revelation 17, verse 4, the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet. These are colors that in those times represented royalty. In Revelation 18, verse 7, she says in her heart, I sit as queen, and I am no widow. She is portrayed, her description is she is both a queen and a prostitute. Okay, in terms of the symbolism that is used by the Lord to convey this reality, she is both a queen and a prostitute. And by prostitute, what we're talking about, again, biblical symbolism, is, next slide, she is both a powerful religious and economic influence in the earth. And the key there with the religious influence in the earth is that biblically, fornication, spiritual fornication, is when someone worships, it's idolatry. It's when someone worships or devotes their worship to someone other than their maker, the one true God, the God of Israel. And a lot of people say, well, this means that she is an apostate. In other words, she was once faithful, she was once married or committed, and then she committed adultery. But the word there is not the word used for adultery, but the word used in general for fornication. Okay, because biblically speaking, if you're a pagan, you're still committing adultery. You're still committing spiritual fornication. If you're not worshiping the one true God of the Bible, the God of your creation, then you are committing spiritual fornication with idols, with false gods. So she is both a powerful religious and economic influence in the earth. Revelation 17, verses 1 through 2. Again, come, I will show you the judgment of the great harlot. She has influence. She sits on many peoples, on many waters. And then the kings of the earth, the leaders and the rulers of the earth, have committed fornication with her. There is an immoral relationship, and through her influence, she has caused the kings of the earth, the rulers of the earth, to engage in idolatry with her. And the inhabitants of the earth were made drunk with the wine of her fornication. The peoples of the earth are drunk with her religious, corrupt, unbiblical religious influence. Next slide. Revelation 18, verse 3. The kings of the earth, this is repeated over and over, the kings of the earth have committed fornication with her, and the merchants of the earth have become rich through the abundance of her luxury. So, she is a consumer. She is an entity that through her purchasing, she makes the merchants of the earth rich. Okay? She is a wealthy entity that causes peoples of the earth to become rich financially, and she spreads her false religious influence in the earth as well. She is guilty for the death of the saints. Revelation 17, verse 6. I saw the woman drunk with the blood of the saints, the holy ones of God, and with the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. She is guilty, she is responsible for the death, for the shed blood of the holy ones, the people of God, which would be Israel, as well as her children, which are in essence the Christians, the followers of Jesus. The holy people of God, she is responsible for their death. Revelation 18, Verse 24, in her was found the blood of prophets and holy ones, saints, and of all who are slain in the earth. She is responsible for a great amount of bloodshed in the earth. This is, it's almost like, what's that party game? Like Who Done It? You know, we lay out all the criteria and everyone's like, who is it? She lives in extravagant luxury. Next slide. Again, this is, you know, an essential description of the woman. Revelation 17, verse 4. The woman was adorned with gold, precious stones, and pearls. She's, you know, glittering. She's covered with all sorts of expensive, precious gems and jewels and gold. Revelation 18:7. She glorified herself and lived luxuriously. This is a key defining description of the woman. She lives luxuriously. Of all of the descriptions that could be used to describe her, she lives luxuriously. And beyond this, the kings of the earth who committed fornication with her, they also lived luxuriously with her. So those that she causes to engage in her corrupt religious practices or you know, various economic relationships, they also live luxuriously with her. Next slide. I've already covered this, but the kings, not only the kings, but also the peoples of the earth commit fornication with her. Revelation 17, 1 through 2, the great harlot sits on many waters. The kings of the earth committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth are actually drunk. They are intoxicated with her religious influence. And then in Revelation 18:9, again, the kings of the earth committed fornication with her. Next slide. The beast nations will hate her. What are the beast nations? The beast nations are the nations that will make up the final empire of the Antichrist, the final coalition of the Antichrist, the union that the Antichrist will bring together. These particular nations will actually hate the woman and turn on her, and the Bible says they will devour her and burn her flesh and eat her. Okay, that's would indicate that they hate her. Revelation 17, 16 through 17. And the 10 horns which you saw on the beast, these are the 10 nations that make up the final manifestation of this beast empire. These will hate the harlot. They will make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh, burn her with fire. For God has put it in their hearts to fulfill His purpose. You see, God uses satanic entities down through history as His rod of judgment against whoever He chooses to do so. In the last days, God will use the surrounding Islamic nations, and whichever nations choose to join up with them, as His rod of chastisement, His final rod of chastisement against His people, not just Israel, but throughout the earth. And then after He's used them as His rod of chastisement, He breaks that rod over His knee and He judges them. But the Lord uses who He wishes as His rod of judgment. Next slide. Again, there is the map of the coming Antichrist alliances. Those are the nations that I suspect most strongly would be the primary nations that will make up the coming coalition of the Antichrist. Again, I believe that will be led by Turkey. Next slide. She represents the greatest false religion that has ever existed. Revelation 17, verse 4 through 5. And on her forehead, there's a name that is written. And every time I read this, I am taken back to high school. And I know some of you have been raised believers, but I'd say a lot of you have been there, where the buddy gets drunk and passes out, and you get out the magic marker, and you write, like, idiot. Then you're like, okay, you got to go home. You know, go home now. And then, you know, they walk in the door, and or whatever, you know, moron, or, you know. Written on her forehead is this: mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and of the abominations of the earth. I don't know how they fit it all on. They shrunk it down to the right font. A lot of people that read this down through history, they've read it through the lens of a Western mindset, and this is what they've concluded. They've essentially said that this woman is the mother of all harlots. In other words, she is the one that has given birth to all of the little harlots throughout the world. So she is sort of the originator of all false religions, and every false religion that's ever come along has been birthed by her. That's what's been seen here. But in fact, what we have here is a classic Eastern expression. It's not saying that she's the mother of all harlots. What it's saying is that she is the greatest harlot that has ever existed. This is classic Eastern expression. You know, we can look at a dozen examples. When Gulf War I, when we went into the Gulf, Saddam Hussein, this is going to be the mother of all battles. The Americans are going to be strewn across the desert. All right, 3 days later, they were all surrendering. It's going to be the mother of all battles. He wasn't saying this is going to be the battle that is going to give birth to thousands of battles. He's saying this is going to be the biggest, the worst, the greatest battle that has ever existed. What this verse is saying, again, talk to anybody throughout the Middle East, they go, no, it's not saying she's going to give birth to a bunch of little harlots. It's saying that she is the greatest harlot that has ever existed. What does that mean? This woman represents the greatest and most significant false religion and unbiblical, ideology that the world has ever known. She is the mother of all harlots. She is the big mama. Next slide. All nations will feel the wrath of her false religion. Revelation 18, verse 3, for all the nations have drunk the wine of the wrath of her false religion, of her fornication, of her idolatry. The effects of her false religion in the earth will cause the Gentiles, all of the nations of the earth, to feel the wrath of her false religion. Next slide, Revelation 18, verse 11 through 15. She is a rabid consumer. The merchants of the earth will weep and mourn over her after she's destroyed. Why? Because no one buys their merchandise anymore. The merchants are upset because she was a purchaser, she was a consumer. And then it goes through and it elaborates specifically on very specific products, all kinds of things, luxurious items. The merchants of these things who became rich by her, they stand at a distance, fearing her torment, her judgment, and they weep. They say, oh, what has become of the great city? Next slide. She is portrayed as a coastal city. Revelation 18, verse 17 through 18. Every shipmaster and all who travel by the ship, okay, those on the sea, those on the ocean, as many as trade on the sea, they stood at a distance and they cried when they saw the smoke of her burning. Okay, and you can't help but think of 9/11, seeing that off in the distance across the harbor as the smoke from the World Trade Centers is rising. That's the picture, is that from the ocean you can see the smoke. When she is destroyed, the smoke of her torment and her destruction is seen from a distance. I don't believe this has anything to do with New York City, but that's the picture that I envision. And they say, who is like this great city? Who is like this entity? Next slide, and this is where we're going to look at 1 Peter 5, verse 13. I believe that the key to identifying Mystery Babylon, that the key verse to identifying the great harlot is found in 1 Peter 5, verse 13. This is, again, 1st century. This is sometime after the spread and the development of the church. And Peter was in Rome at the time. Now, there have been some Protestants who have said that Peter was not in Rome. And the reason is because there have been some that have seen this as a validation of the Roman Catholic idea that he was the first bishop of Rome, and they've tried to fight against that. And so they kind of go through these real strong efforts to try to say that he was not in Rome, but he was actually in Babylon. The fact of the matter is that when you look at the early documents of the church consistently, I mean, it's really not even debatable, he was in Rome. History validates that. All of the writings of the early church validate that. Babylon at the time was an absolute, just a ruin. There was nothing there. And there's no historical evidence that he was actually in Babylon. Peter was in Rome, and when he was in Rome, he said this, at the end of his epistle, he said, she, speaking of the church, who is in Babylon. Okay, Peter was in Rome, and he referred to Rome as Babylon. This is consistent with several other 1st century Jewish documents where the Jews referred to Rome as Babylon as well. The Syllabine oracles and a couple other sort of apocryphal, unbiblical books refer to Rome, the city of Rome, as Babylon. Peter said, "She who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends her greetings," as doth my son Mark. The early church understood Babylon as a code word for Rome at the time. Okay? In the first century, the city of Rome was viewed as Babylon by the early church, as well as the Jews of the first century. Next slide. What I derive from this is that the early church understood this phrase, Babylon, as a code word for the primary capital, the capital city of the reigning beast empire. So try to follow this. Throughout biblical history, in Revelation 17, it describes this in detail. We've had 7 biblical and historical pagan empires, a succession of historical anti-Yahvistic, anti-Christ empires that have been at enmity with the people of Israel, at enmity with God, at enmity with the church once it came along. So these empires are Assyria, and then we had, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and then Rome. Okay, those are 6. After Rome came the Islamic Empire. Those are 7. And then the Bible tells us that a revived version of the 7th will come back as the 8th. It says in Revelation 17, and that will be the final manifestation of the Antichrist's geographic stronghold in the earth. Now, in the first century, try to follow this, the Roman Empire was actually Satan's physical method to persecute and come against the people of Israel. Okay, these were all empires that were anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, and they all worshipped pagan gods, and they were in conflict with the God of Israel. Now, Rome was the capital of that empire. Rome was the economic and spiritual capital of the reigning anti-Christ empire in the earth. And so at enmity at the time, you had Jerusalem and Rome, God's city, Satan's city. And the church referred to Rome as Babylon. It was the Babylon of the early church. And so my thesis is this. Mystery Babylon, that phrase, Mystery Babylon, can simply be interpreted as this, spiritual Babylon. Mystery Babylon is not literal Babylon. Next slide. It was, okay, it began, the concept of Babylon began with literal Babylon. But throughout history, as there's been this ebb and flow in the movement of these world empires, Satan's geographic stronghold in the earth has moved around. It's changed with wars and the flux and the rise of various nations. And by the first century, Rome was the new reigning capital of Satan in the earth. It was the capital of world idolatry, and it was also the economic stronghold of Satan's work in the earth. Okay, so it's the spiritual and financial power base of Satan. It's literally Satan's geographic stronghold in the earth at any given time. And again, it migrates 2 slides forward, 1 more back. Apologize. This is interesting from the 4th century. Tychonius, this is one of the earliest full commentaries on the book of Revelation that we have, and referring to Mystery Babylon, Tychonius says, by it, the city of the people of the devil are signified. Very, very direct, very simple. Next slide. So here you have the 7 heads of the beast, and again, the 7 heads of the beast represent the 7 empires that I spoke of down through history. So you had Egypt, Assyria, and then number 3 was Babylon. That's where the concept of Babylon began, and then by the first century, Rome was the reigning capital of Satan in the earth. It was his stronghold in the earth. Now, the next world empire that came along in the region was the 7th, the Islamic Empire. It's the only empire in world history that matches all of the criteria that the Bible lays out. And then the Bible says that the 7th will come back as an 8th. Whatever the 7th empire is, it will be revived. In Revelation 17, it gives us this riddle. It says 5 have been, 1 is, then it says, and then the other will come, the 7th. Rome was the 6th. Those that have a Roman-centric view, they say, well, yeah, Rome was the 6th, and then Rome is the 7th, and then Rome is the 8th. You know, and it doesn't work. It's no longer a revived Roman Empire. And then it's interesting now that the European Union, they're saying that it might break up. And so you have the rise of the Roman Empire and then the collapse again. Are we going to have it? You know, how many times is this going to happen? The Bible is and has always been Middle Eastern centric. The Roman Empire shifts to the west, but all of these other empires were really centered in the Middle East. And the Islamic Empire meets all of the biblical criteria to match the next beast empire, if you will. Next slide. The reigning beast empire today is, in fact, the Islamic Empire. It is the greatest anti-Israel, anti-Semitic, anti-Christ, pagan empire in the earth. Okay, the Islamic Empire. It is the greatest stronghold of Satan in the earth. Now, here's my question. What is the capital of the Islamic world? Oh, actually, anybody want to try to answer that? What is the capital of the Islamic world? The center of the Islamic world, the center of world idolatry, next slide, is Mecca. Nearly 1.6 billion people every day, 5 times a day, bow down and pray to ground zero in that map. And as they are doing that, make no mistake, they are worshiping Satan. Okay? They may believe that they're worshiping the one true God. It's not the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible did not place a shrine to himself in Mecca. 1.6 billion people, 5 times a day, are kneeling and praying to a false God. Mecca today is the world capital of idolatry. And so, next slide, the theory, the thesis of this session is that the kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Mecca, as the spiritual and financial capital of the reigning beast empire of this age, is the fulfillment of this prophecy in Revelation 17 and 18. Next slide. We're going to unpack that in the next session, but before we do, what I want to do is walk through some of the other alternative possibilities, those that have been offered, one of which I really held to for some years, and I want to unpack why I believe that they do not meet all of the biblical criteria to be the fulfillment of this prophecy. So the next slide, theory number 1, and this seems to be very popular right now, is the idea that literal Babylon in Iraq will reemerge as a world and a global economic powerhouse, and that we will see the rise again of literal Babylon. And so Mystery Babylon, this great mystery down through the ages, that which is, you know, so difficult to figure out, is actually simply literal Babylon. And if I'm to be honest, that seems incredibly anticlimactic, and I don't even understand, you know, it doesn't make sense. Why all the hubbub about Mystery Babylon and all of these commands to discern and figure these things out? There's no mystery at all. Why not just call it Babylon? He made a point that this is Mystery Babylon. It's spiritual Babylon. It's more than just literal Babylon. The second reason why I don't believe that literal Babylon is the Mystery Babylon is because literal Babylon is simply not an economic powerhouse. Now, there was an article that was run this past year about $700,000 that was donated to rebuild the ancient city of Babylon. And in some prophecy circles, this made a big splash. And everyone's like, they're rebuilding Babylon. Babylon today is a very small tourist destination out in the desert of Iraq, where they're trying to rebuild some of the ruins of ancient Babylon where people can go and see that. But by and large, it's a small village, I think, where some of the U.S. military have been staying. But guys, $700,000, you know, I've been involved in my own private business, and doing business for various homeowners and so forth. I regularly do business with folks who live in houses that are small that are $700,000. You can't rebuild a city with $700,000. You know, it's like they're rebuilding Babylon. $700,000 is not impressive. Make it, you know, 70 billion, and then we'll have a something to look at. But the bottom line is there's nothing trending in that direction at all. Nothing trending in that direction. It would have to literally arise out of the desert, you know, in a way similar to what we've seen recently with Dubai, where they've just poured in billions to create a city, and there's really nothing there. There's no reason why they would pour billions into Babylon. Not saying it can't happen, but it sure as heck is not a possibility today, nor is it trending in that direction. Literal Babylon does not rule over the kings of the earth. There's no influence over the kings of the earth. It doesn't fulfill that criteria at all. Literal Babylon is not drunk on the blood of the saints. We could go down the list. There's really nothing to look at in Babylon other than the title Babylon. That's really it. Anything beyond that is speculation. And there's been a lot of speculation. Anything beyond that is speculation. Next slide. Theory number 2 is that the Catholic Church, or Rome itself, is Mystery Babylon. Now, again, as I just discussed, Rome was, in fact, Babylon. It was. In the 1st century, Rome was the spiritual capital of world idolatry that was coming against Israel, but it's no longer the capital of the Beast Empire. In fact, the Roman Empire collapsed many years ago. The Islamic Empire conquered the last vestiges of Roman authority in Constantinople as it became Istanbul. But Rome today, and even the Catholic Church today, is a fraction as powerful as it once was. It used to be an empire, the Holy Roman Empire. Today, Islam has bypassed the Catholic Church in terms of numbers. There are more Muslims in the world than there are Catholics. The Catholic Church is not an economic powerhouse. Sure, they have a lot of land holdings, they have a lot of money, but they don't have so much money that they are wielding power over the kings of the earth. Yes, that may have been the case, but we are speaking of an end-time entity. We are speaking of an entity that will exist at the end of the age, that will be judged by the final beast empire just prior to the return of Christ. The Catholic Church is not what it once was. The Catholic Church is not drunk on the blood of the saints. Now, in the past, they persecuted Protestants, and they shed a lot of Protestant blood, but they have since publicly repented. Next slide. In a sermon entitled Universal Prayer, Confession of Sins and Asking for Forgiveness, now just let me repeat that, confession of sins and asking for forgiveness, Pope John Paul II expressed regret and repentance over the historical sins of those Catholics who persecuted or sinned against women, Jews, Gypsies, other Christians, and Catholics. That was from an article by Stephen Clone. So here's my question. Do you hold to a gospel which says that if you repent of your sins, that you'll still be punished? Or do we hold to a gospel that says that when you publicly repent, you call something sin, you say you're sorry, that you're actually forgiven? That's the gospel that I hold to. The Catholic Church, during the Reformation, so forth, persecuted a lot of Christians. But if the truth be fully known, if the Protestants had had the power, they probably would have killed as many Catholics. And in fact, there was a lot of killing that went back and forth. You know, we can pull out stuff where John Calvin had his theological enemies burnt, tortured. You know, there was a lot of nasty stuff that was going on back then, and it was primarily carried about the Catholics because they had the power. But that's not the world that I live in today, and the Catholic Church has repented. And that factor is not taken into consideration when everyone points to the fact that they're guilty of the blood of all these martyrs, and they will be punished. You know, the head of the church has to count for something. Next slide. The Vatican does not sit in a desert. You know, I haven't personally been to Rome, but it's not what you could call a deserted, lonely place. The merchants of the earth would not see her burning, or at least not to the degree that I think that it's portraying. She's roughly 20 miles inland. And despite our differences, the Vatican does uphold the doctrines of the faith, the Trinity, the divine incarnation of God in Messiah, the cross of Yeshua. the theology of the Antichrist specifically denies all of these things. So yes, there are theological differences that we need to wrestle through, things that came up in the Reformation, and these are things that we can work through. But nevertheless, the Catholic Church does preach the cross. They do espouse the Trinity and all of the essentials of the faith. Yeah, we can wrestle about works versus faith alone and all those kind of things. But in terms of these things, there's no comparison between the Catholic Church and the brazen, direct, confrontational denial of every essential doctrine of the Christian faith in the Quran. A denial of the cross, a denial of the incarnation, a denial of the divine sonship of Christ. Okay? It's you know, apples and oranges, or what do we say? It's not apples for oranges. I mean, there's no comparison. Next slide. Theory number 3. A lot of folks have seen in the prophecy of Mystery Babylon, they've seen USA or New York City. First of all, the USA does not represent a false religion. Maybe consumerism or maybe selfishness or you know, an egocentric mentality, but it's certainly not a false religion. The USA does not exist in a desert. The USA is not drunk on the blood of the saints. In fact, the USA has been one of the greatest missionary sending and funding entities that the world has ever known. The USA is rapidly collapsing and will likely never fully recover. I hope that's not true, but it seems to me that whenever I listen to non-optimistic, not purposely optimistic economists, it's inevitable that we have much more difficult times ahead. Next slide. Theory number 4 is that Jerusalem is Mystery Babylon. And not just Jerusalem, but in fact the religious leadership of Jerusalem, but Jerusalem itself as a city. The first problem with that, to me that's glaring, is that the Messiah comes to reign over the earth specifically, and he will rule from Jerusalem for 1,000 years. Yet, Jerusalem, well, yeah, Jerusalem is the city which will bear God's name eternally. Mystery Babylon, on the other hand, it says, it's very clear, it will be utterly destroyed and it will burn forever. It says the smoke of her torment will rise forever. No longer will it be seen in her. You know, people getting married or commerce or any of these things. It speaks of desolate place where jackals and owls dwell, and she smokes forever. Well, how does that work? If Jerusalem is going to be destroyed and burnt with fire, this is the same city where Jesus says he's going to come back and rule forever. That's a serious conflict. It's a problem. Jerusalem is not an economic or political powerhouse. Next slide. So we're going to take a break now for a few minutes, and then we're going to come back and unpack the theory of Saudi Arabia as Mystery Babylon. We're going to look at the evidence when we come back.
It's good here. Really good. Boys, be quiet.
We're going to look at the evidence for Saudi Arabia as the fulfillment of Revelation 17 and 18 as the great harlot. Next slide. First question, first criterion. Does Saudi Arabia sit in a desert? That's an actual picture of a Saudi desert. Saudi Arabia today is the proverbial fulfillment. I mean, she is the literal fulfillment of what the Bible was referring to when it says she was in an eremos, in a desert. Saudi Arabia is the Arab Sea, the great desert, the desert of the sea. And so the answer is absolutely yes. Next slide. Is Saudi Arabia royalty? In the late 1800s, Ibn al-Wahhab, he was a sort of an Islamist reformer, good friends with Ibn al-Saud, and these two together really emerged in the past century as the rulers of Saudi Arabia. Ibn al-Wahhab more of the religious side of things, and then the Saudis as the political leaders. And today, the Saudi royals are one of the most corrupt and powerful monarchies in the earth. Is she both a powerful religious and economic influence in the earth? Next slide. Saudi Arabia is, in essence, the very womb of Islam. She is the heart of Islam. The Saudi monarchy are the custodians of the two holy mosques, the two holy cities, as they say it, Mecca and Medina. They are the custodians of, again, Mecca, the world capital of idolatry. Is she a powerful religious and economic influence in the earth? Next slide, some basic facts regarding Saudi Arabia. They have a GDP 3 times larger than the UAE. The UAE being Dubai and Abu Dhabi. How many of you have looked at pictures of Dubai in recent years? They have the world's tallest building that they named the Khalifa Tower, the Khalif Tower. They've built literally man-made islands out in the ocean that are shaped like these stylized palm trees lined with multi-million-dollar mansions, hundreds of them along these palm fronds, just sitting out in the blue ocean. They've got Dubai World, it's called, where they've built man-made islands, all in the shape of various countries, so that if you want, you can buy a United States-shaped island, your own private island. And I think even like Brad Pitt and various American celebrities have spent multi millions of dollars to buy these private islands, and just it's unbelievable to watch. And the amount of money, I think it's something like a couple of years ago, it was like 3/4 of all of the cranes in the earth were in this one city. Just the growth was amazing. Saudi Arabia has a GDP 3 times larger than the UAE, just for context. She exports more oil than any other nation in the earth. And of course, the world runs on oil. It is the lifeblood of industry, of everything. They export more oil than any other nation. They are the oil exporting alpha dog of the world. They also have the greatest percentage of oil reserves, at least allegedly, under the ground, more than any other nation in the world. And again, they are home to Mecca. So yes, Saudi Arabia is an economic powerhouse, hands down, and yes, Saudi Arabia is a spiritual influence in the earth. Next slide. Does Saudi Arabia live in extravagant luxury? Does the Saudi monarchy, do they live in what we could call extravagant luxury? If the Bible was trying to describe and prophesy and hearken to a reality, would this be the description that would apply to the Saudis? Next slide. Case in point is the Saudi Prince Al-Walid bin Talal. This guy is someone that you should get to know. Next slide. Here is his diamond-studded $4.8 million Mercedes. It's his 38th car. Of course, by now, I'm sure he has many more. This was at a car show recently. I'm not sure if it was in Dubai or Saudi or the United States. It was probably, I don't know, it could have been anywhere. Next slide, just so you can see the size of the diamonds. They're not small diamonds. Again, these are toys. $4.8 million. It's a toy. Why would you cover a car with diamonds? I mean, why not just kind of go extravagant and gold-plate it like most other eccentric billionaires? No, you got to cover it with diamonds. The deceased King Fahd, okay, this was the last king. Just a few examples. This is from a book by Gerald Posner called Secrets of the Kingdom, the Inside Story of the Saudi-U.S. Connection. He said this is a quote: "The deceased King Fahd owned dozens, not just a dozen, dozens of palaces, each one grander than the last. His official palace was essentially a tiny Vatican city with opulent furnishings and walls that ran several miles around the perimeter. Architects who worked on the palaces estimated that they were worth several billion in the 1980s. Okay, in the 1980s. Today, I don't know with inflation what several billion would be worth. That is one of his palaces. One of his palaces was worth several billion. Now, King Fahd had a son, or still has a son, Prince Aziz. They called him Azuzi, which in Arabic is like dearie, like little dearie. And he, as well as having multiple homes, he essentially built for himself sort of an Islamic, like Michael Jackson's Wonderland Ranch. He literally built for himself a replica of the White House. I mean, it was just this bizarre, you know, with all of these shrines and Islamic mosque-looking buildings, and it was estimated to be worth $4.6 billion. Okay, now think of this: a private residence, one of many, and all you are is the son of a king, and one of your properties is worth $46,000 million. That's the kind of money that you have at your disposal. Now, just as we're discussing these things, we're discussing luxury. Is there a great American quarterback, an American president, a rap artist, an actor, an extravagant real estate mogul? Is there anybody that you can think of, a computer nerd, that has that kind of money to waste and to throw around? That kind of wealth. Next slide. This is, again, speaking of King Fahd. He also had a 100-room house in Marbella, Spain, a spectacular estate outside of Paris that was initially built for the 18th century French kings. It was built for kings. He had a mansion near London on which he spent nearly $60 million in refurbishments, a remodel. I would have liked to have been a contractor on that deal. We only charge 15%. And a sprawling palatial in Geneva, in which he was fond of boasting, had over 15,000 telephone lines. He flew between cities in his private 747, fitted with an enormous pink master bedroom, gold, literally gold toilets, mahogany elevator, sauna, baccarat, crystal chandeliers. His yacht was $50 million. He kept over 24 Rolls Royces fitted with gold hood ornaments and grills in his various homes. Again, King Fahd, this is the deceased King Fahd. This is stuff that goes back to the 80s. Next slide. How she has glorified herself and lived luxuriously. Does this apply? Would this be fitting to apply to the Saudi monarchy? Are there anyone else? Is there any other royal entity in the world? Is there any other royal entity that lives in a desert in the earth that we can imagine that would compare to the Saudis with regard to the luxury and the amount of wealth that they possess? Next slide. Do the kings and the peoples of the earth commit fornication with her? Next slide. Again, I mentioned Prince Al-Walid bin Talal. In June of 2006, just a few years ago, CARE, that's the Council of American Islamic Relations, announced that it was planning a meeting with bin Talal. Now, CARE sets itself up as sort of an Islamic civil rights entity. It's nothing but an Islamic propaganda, really a jihadist movement here in the States. I don't mean military jihad, but legal and intellectual jihad to try to spread the propaganda of Islam in the States and to, push its way through the legal system for the gradual implication of Islamic law. The spokesperson for CARE, Ibrahim Hooper, stated outright, this is an American news guy that converted to Islam, became the spokesperson for CARE. He came right out and said that he desired to see the Constitution of the United States replaced with Islamic law. And he said, I'm not going to use physical violence to make that happen, but that's what I want. Okay? That is an enemy of the country. This is who CARE is. They try to present themselves as deserving to partake in the national discussion. They should be pushed aside as radicals and as enemies of the country. They should be marginalized, but yet they are received by politicians and by the media as having a legitimate voice. They should have no such thing. Prince Talal donated $50 million to CARE to devise a campaign to create a better understanding of Islam and Muslims in the U.S. Prince Talal also donated, and we'll touch on this, next slide, $20 million to Harvard to create an Islamic studies program. He donated another $20 million to Georgetown. He came to Harvard and he lectured the Harvard students on the need for the United States and Americans to be more tolerant of Islam. Now, to put this in context, you have a Saudi prince who comes from a country where it is illegal to openly practice Christianity or any other religion, where up until a few years ago you couldn't even enter the country if you were Jewish. You're not allowed to build a single church, synagogue, or anything other than a mosque in that country. And he comes to the United States and tells us that we need to be more tolerant. Okay, that is the very picture, the very definition of hypocrisy. Harvard was influenced. They committed financial fornication with this man. They received his $20 million, which is nothing more than the spread of an Islamic propaganda educational machine coming out of Harvard. Same thing with Georgetown, and they have John Esposito, who is a Islamist apologist, an American professor who writes and gets interviews, and again, he's treated as though he deserves a voice in the discussion. He is an Islamist, and he is paid for, and he's in the back pocket of the Saudis to the tune of millions of dollars. Okay, this is how it works. You don't give someone $20 million for no reason. Okay, you expect something in return. This is how it works. I don't mean to be cynical, but my dad was right. Next slide. Nothing's for free. Jimmy Carter. He is perhaps, there he is with bin Talal. Jimmy Carter is perhaps the most corrupted politician, president that this country has seen in years, okay, in decades. He is absolutely, completely in the back pocket of the Saudis. We're going to look at some of the details. Next slide. He refuses to disclose the amount of money that Saudi financiers have donated. He refuses to announce that. Some of what we do know, however, in the late 1970s, a BCCI, that was a brazenly anti-Semitic Saudi-funded bank, controlled actually by the Saudi royal family, bailed him out. They bailed his family peanut farm out, to the tune of millions of dollars. The founder of BCCI gave Carter $500,000 to help him establish the Carter Center. I'm not sure exactly what his center is called. And then they gave him more tn $10 million donation to his various projects. Again, this is going back to the 1970s. Going back to the 1970s. I don't know what $10 million is the equivalent of today. Next slide. In 1993, King Fahd presented Carter with a gift of $7.6 million. A gift. Merry Christmas. Here's $7.6 million. The king is only one of several Saudi royals that have donated multiple millions to Carter. As of 2005, again, bin Talal, I spell his name differently there, he's donated over $5 million to Carter's center. Next slide. He received multiple millions from this individual, Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Nahyan. He is a brazen anti-Semite. He is a Jew hater. Okay, he is a Jew hater. The Zayed Center for the Coordination and Follow-Up, a group funded by Zayed, he hosted various speakers. Among the speakers, some referred to Jews as the enemies of all nations. Okay, that sounds like Nazism to me. He attributed the assassination of John Kennedy to Israel and the Mossad. He blamed 9/11 on the attacks. He blamed the 9/11 attacks on the United States against our own military, and he stated that the Holocaust was a fable. Okay, is this the kind of group that you would like to be associated with if you cared about your reputation? Next slide. They also hosted a speech by Jimmy Carter. He was happy to speak there. He was happy to receive millions of dollars from Zayed. Harvard University, who did accept the money from Walid, refused to take the money from Zayed because he was so openly outspoken in his anti-Semitism and his Jew hatred. Okay, even Harvard refused the money. Carter, however, chose to keep the money. And then he said this, with regard to the financial award that he received, he said, "This award has special significance for me because it is named for my personal friend, Sheikh Zayed bin Sultan Al Nahyan." This is one of our presidents. Next slide. The Saudi-based bin Laden family, okay, i.e. Osama bin Laden, they're a construction family, the most significant construction family in Saudi Arabia. They've donated large sums of money to Carter. Despite the Saudi Arabian government's vast and ongoing records of human rights abuses. Now, Saudi Arabia is one of the grossest violators of human rights in the world. You know, I mean, if you get caught stealing a car in Saudi Arabia, you know, you could be beheaded in the streets. There are literally human slaves in Saudi Arabia working to build that nation, living in these little trailers at night. They lock them in there, and then they let them out. These women come from the Philippines, you know, Catholic women. They think they're going to be house servants. They end up becoming sex slaves, mistresses, all sanctioned by the Quran. There was a case just a couple of years ago where a Saudi couple was arrested because they brought a Filipino housemaid with them, and she was essentially a sex slave. And then when they got found out, they were arrested. The couple was arrested. The wife was fully complicit with this. And then we literally had Saudi representatives from Saudi Arabia came over, and they said, "You can't arrest him because you're violating his religious rights." Telling the United States that in our country we can't arrest somebody for slavery because that's his right religiously. Luckily, we didn't cave into that one. That's the type of human rights violations that result when you try to enforce Islamic Sharia law, okay? Now, despite that, despite all of the human rights abuses, in terms of even just these liberal, secular human rights groups, they rate Saudi Arabia as among the worst. Iran is among the worst. Whenever you try to put into place Islamic Sharia law, the result is always the violation of human rights and women's rights and children's rights. The average age for a woman, when the age that she gets married in Yemen, just south of Saudi Arabia, is 14. Okay, so now think of the range, span out about 5 years in each direction, and that's the average range that a woman gets married. You have recently had an 8-year-old girl who was able to get a divorce from a man in Saudi Arabia because he was in his 30s. She says all he does is chase me around all day for sex. Okay, that's legal according to Islam. 8-year-old girl. She's been married for a few years. Okay, that's abuse. That is child abuse. Despite Saudi Arabia's record of human rights abuse, the Carter Center for Human Rights Program has zero activity in Saudi Arabia. Why? Do you think the multiple $1 million has anything to do with it? And here is the ultimate hypocrisy. Carter is an outspoken critic of what he calls the Jewish lobby. The powerful, all-powerful Jewish lobby, the evil Zionists, with their tentacles spread throughout the whole world, influencing American foreign policy. Folks, when you compare the amount of money that Israel donates to American politicians compared to the millions that the Saudis donate to every American politician of influence, there is no comparison. There is no comparison, and yet he speaks out against the evil Jewish lobby, and then he claims that anyone, any reporter, any politician who has ever received Jewish donations or who has friends that are outspoken Zionists, that they cannot speak to the Middle Eastern situation. And yet, despite the millions of dollars that he receives from the Saudis, he is an outspoken critic of Israel. Okay? The epitome, the essence of hypocrisy. Next slide. He's the author of this rampant distortion of facts, Palestine, peace, not apartheid, accusing Israel of being an apartheid occupying force, a violator of human rights. Okay, Israel today is the democracy, is the outpost of democracy in the Middle East. Okay, should we refrain from uncritical criticism of Israel? Of course not. Israel should be subject to criticism just like any other nation. But you know something? You know who are the most outspoken critics of Israel? The Israelis. Okay? They hold themselves accountable. And you have a nation which is one of the most moral, one of the nations that has shown the most restraint, who has shipped humanitarian supplies to her enemies, who has shown more morality and more ethics than virtually any other nation in the world, despite the onslaught against her. And yet, despite the fact that she's surrounded by a sea of nations that are brazen violators of human rights on every count, she receives more criticism than any other nation in the world. And even the UN, deeply influenced by the Saudi and the Palestinian lobby, even they have issued more condemnations of Israel than every other nation in the world combined. Is this fair in any way, shape, or form? And of course, the Saudi millions produced, they got their results, and Carter has become a propagandist for the Saudis. Next slide. Is it just Carter? Well, of course not. Bill Clinton, there's the, just before the Obama election, and they were trying to determine if Hillary was if she had been corrupted by Saudi money, so they had to open up the Clintons' record of donations. Next slide. Over $20 to $32 million came from Gulf Arabs and Saudis. The most came directly from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Now, just please put this in context. $20 to $32 million in donations. What do they expect back from that? Now, our Secretary of State, the present Secretary of State, has received $20 to $32 million. Is there any chance that there could be a conflict of interest here? Do we think that there's any measure of influence peddling, purchasing influence? Do you think that this will have anything to bear on how our Secretary of State deals with issues in the Middle East? Do you think that will result in any undue prejudice against Israel and in favor of the Palestinians and so forth? Next slide. The whole Bush family, as much as I hate to admit it, are probably some of the worst in terms of having a long relational and financial history, and having also received millions upon millions of dollars from the Saudis. The George H.W. Bush, the father, the son, they have long family ties with the Saudi royals. They're close friends with Prince Bandar. He was the former American ambassador from Saudi Arabia, ambassador of Saudi Arabia to the United States for many years. And the Bush family is really no different than any of the previous presidents. Next slide. Why is this information so unknown? I mean, it's not unknown, but why it's so big? I mean, it's so in your face. Why is this not discussed more? Why is it that usually what we hear is a criticism of the Israel lobby? Why don't we hear more about the Saudi lobby? Saudi money, not only does it buy influence, it buys silence. It's that simple. They're paying people millions of... It's not just presidents. It's senators. It's Colin Powell. It's Condoleezza Rice. It's virtually every senator that has retired, that has gotten out. They get on some sort of a board, being a consultant, or just being on some board and getting a couple $100,000 a year just for essentially doing nothing, and that buys influence. This is perhaps the most taboo subject in Washington. There was a book or a report that was written a few years ago where they were trying to blow this whole story open, and the whole thing got shelved. This is a subject you don't talk about. You don't bring this up. Everybody is involved. The secrecy, going back to biblical prophecy, the secrecy of the harlot's sins and her influence are specifically mentioned by Yahweh through the prophet Isaiah, Isaiah 47, verses 7 through 10. You have trusted in your wickedness, the Lord speaking to the harlot, and you have said, no one sees me. No one sees me. Your wisdom and knowledge mislead you when you say to yourself, I am, and there is none beside me. There is an arrogance, there is a confidence, and she believes that what she does is done in secret, and the world turns the other way. I pulled a couple of quotes out of, next slide. Robert Baer, he's a former CIA agent. He wrote a book called Sleeping with the Devil, How Washington Sold Our Souls for Saudi Crude. I mean, it's almost, I mean, this guy's, I don't think he's a believer. He's just a former CIA agent that's had a lot of firsthand experience in the Middle East. And the title of the book is almost prophetic. You know, we're speaking of the harlot that has committed fornication with the kings of the earth, and he titles his book Sleeping with the Devil, How Washington Sold Our Souls for Saudi Crude. Here's just a few quotes that I pulled out of his book with reference to the sort of the code of silence that surrounds the measure of the incestuous relationship between the American government and the Saudis. He said, Saudi Arabia's seduction of Washington worked the same way. They paid, we took, and everyone politely averted their eyes. The only people who were willing to tell the truth were those on the political fringe, because everybody on the political inside is getting the money, and those on the political fringe, were smugly dismissed as cranks. In other words, of course, that's just, you know, some radical right-wing whatever. Of course, he's filled with all sorts of bizarre conspiracy theories. Next slide. Not to mention our present president, the recent event of him bowing, the bow that never took place. He was just much taller, and so he just had to bend down in order to shake his hand. That was the official explanation, even though, you know, and there's another picture too where it's clear. I mean, he's bowing down. Maybe it was just bad practice, inexperience. You know, I'm gonna give him the benefit of the doubt, but it was absolutely foolish. Has he had any influence from Saudi money? Next slide. This is from Newsmax. What's the date on that? September, I think, 2008. Obama had close ties to top Saudi advisor at an early age. According to the reports, Obama was friends with this one particular individual. He was had been a former black nationalist, Black Panther, kind of a radical guy, and then he converted to Islam, and he kind of worked his way in and got to be good friends with a bunch of Saudis, and he had a good relationship with Prince Talal bin Al-Walid bin Talal, and apparently Obama's degree at Columbia and Harvard were paid for by Saudi princes. So again, even, you know, before he became president, going far back, the present president also has been influenced by the Saudis. And, you know, this is one that it's like he refuses to even bring, you know, to allow anybody to discuss this. He's probably been the best at sort of keeping all of this stuff under wraps. Next slide. Revelation 17:18 and then 18 verse 9. Just in light of what we've discussed, and really we've only skimmed the surface, in terms of really looking at we've just skimmed the surface. The woman whom you saw reigns over the kings of the earth. The kings of the earth committed fornication and lived luxuriously with her. Is that an accurate description of what we are seeing in the earth today with the Saudi lobby buying influence in the most powerful nation in the world? And it's not just the United States, it's England, it's all over the place. They are the only nation in the world that has that kind of money, that has that kind of wealth. The world runs on oil. Next slide. Is Saudi Arabia guilty for the blood of the saints, for the blood of the holy ones? Are they guilty for the blood of the Jews and the followers of Jesus? Next slide. The same Prince Al-Walid bin Talal, during a live telethon in April of 2002, sponsored by the Saudi government, this one particular Muslim preacher, so they're having a telethon, they're raising money for Palestinian suicide bombers. They're raising money for Palestine. It went to the families of suicide bombers. Here's what one Muslim preacher said. I am against America. Now again, mind you, in Saudi Arabia, these things aren't on unless they are sanctioned by the government. Okay? These are preachers that are paid for by the government, raised up and trained by the government, and then given a national platform by the government. I am against America until this life ends, until the day of judgment, al-Qiyamah. I am against America. She is the root of all evils and wickedness on the earth. Muslim brothers in Palestine do not have any mercy, neither compassion on the Jews. Their blood, their money, their flesh, their women are yours to take legitimately. God made them yours. Why don't you enslave their women? Why don't you wage jihad? Why don't you pillage them? Okay, Saudi trained preachers raised on Saudi indoctrination and given a national platform, okay, that is worse than Nazism, okay? In our midst, in our world today, that is far worse than Nazism. Next slide. Prince Talal responded by donating $27 million. He was the largest donor in the entire telethon. They raised $110 million. According to Israeli intelligence, the money was the main source of funding that went to 36 families of Palestinian terrorists, including 8 families of suicide bombers. Okay? They know where the money was going. Okay? Prince Talal, the guy that comes over here and lectures us about needing to be more tolerant, the one who sets up programs and donates money to help make the image of Islam better in the United States. On the other hand, donates $27 million to fund the slaughter of Jews, and who supports the type of hate rhetoric that comes out of these kind of preachers. This is what we're dealing with. Are they guilty for the blood of the saints? The Saudi lobby is guilty for influencing anti-Israeli sentiment, not just in the United States, but throughout the world. They have deeply influenced the opinions of the UN, this alleged body of representatives throughout the world. We have a world where anti-Semitism is increasing day by day. And then throughout the world, now please follow this, the Saudis, they raise up and train these hate preachers. They pay for and fund the establishment of the madrasas, the Islamic centers, and the mosques throughout the world, and then they send the hate preachers there, and then they send their books and their literature there. And throughout the United States, you can go into the mosques and you can find the literature with the Saudi government seal of approval on it that encourages jihad against Christians and Americans and Jews. And they are paying for it, and they are the womb of Islam, both historically and today. And not just Islam, but radical Islam. They are the primary source, financially and ideologically, of the spread of radicalism throughout the world today. Okay, now, listen to this one. The largest missionary sending organization in the world is the Southern Baptist Convention. The Saudi Arabian government spends more every 3 days on dawah, that's Islamic evangelism, that the Southern Baptists spend their budget every year. The Saudi Arabian government puts more money forward every 3 days than the largest Christian missionary, Protestant missionary organization in the world spends in an entire year. Saudi Arabia is the source of the violence and the terrorism and the hatred throughout the world today. And our government will do nothing about it because they are in their back pocket. Is the Saudi Arabian government guilty of the blood of the holy ones throughout the earth? Next slide. This is from the Middle Eastern Media Research Institute. For decades, the royal family of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has been the main financial supporter of Palestinian groups fighting Israel. They have given over 15 billion Saudi riyals, that's 4 billion US, to finance the continuation of the Intifada, which is also commonly referred to by the Saudi officials as jihad and resistance. They are funding the jihad in Israel. They are funding the jihad around the world. Next slide. Revelation 17:6 and 18:24. I saw the woman. She was drunk with the blood of the holy ones, of the saints, and the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. In her was found the blood of prophets and saints, and all who are slain on the earth. Go to the website, The Religion of Peace. Every day he updates the various Islamic terrorist attacks and the deaths that result as a result of Islamic terrorism. We don't even hear about it. We've got, terrorism, jihad fatigue. We don't want to hear a news story every day, but they take place around the world every day. In her was found the blood of all who were slain on the earth. Next slide. Do the beast nations hate her? Next slide. These are the nations of Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Libya, Sudan. Ironically, other than Turkey, all of the nations included there tend to be some of the most rabidly radical Islamists. But see, there's a few things going on there. Saudi Arabia sits just south of Iraq, there on the map. is that what you have in the Middle East is essentially you have the two alpha dog nations. You have Saudi Arabia, and then you have Iran. Saudi Arabia rules over the two holy mosques. Again, they're the primary oil producers and the primary oil exporters, etc. Iran, being Shia, being of the minority sect of the Shia Muslims, they desperately want to export the Iranian Revolution, and they want to become the new alpha dog. They would love to supplant Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is terrified of them having nukes. It's not just Israel. Okay? Saudi Arabia and Iran in many ways are enemies. Saudi Arabia are the Sunnis, Iran are the Shia, and the Iranians do want to control the region. Historically, Turkey and Saudi Arabia are also at enmity because Turkey ruled the region, and they believe, in fact, that they should still be controlling the holy mosques. They believe that they're the rightful rulers of that entire region, and the Saudi royals have come along and sort of supplanted them in this last century. And beyond that, Saudi Arabia, essentially, the government of Saudi Arabia today, I wonder if I have this in the, yeah, I do. The Saudi Arabian government is essentially like the Branch Davidian Waco cult. Okay? They spend money on the military because they know there's a giant clash coming. They know they are going to be attacked. They know that day is coming. They're very well aware of it. Next slide. This is understood really by people who study the Middle East, those involved in all of this. There's actually been a book discussing the sort of incestuous dance that the Saudis do, because on one side, they live like Westerners, they live like pigs, they live non-Islamic lifestyles, they live just lives of, you know, brazen perversion and so forth with their harems. And then on the other hand, they pay off the radicals, they fund the radicals, but they know the day is coming when the monster that they've created is going to turn on them. And many of the nations, the beast nations, are some of the greatest vehicles of a lot of these radicals. And even within the country, the Saudis have many that are eventually going to desire to kick out the Saudi royals and replace them with a legitimate Islamic government and not a corrupt monarchy. They view them as completely corrupt. And the Saudi royals are afraid of their own people. They're afraid of their own radicals that they create. So they do this dance. On one hand, they try to be friends with the West, and on the other hand, they pay off the radicals. And they have a day of reckoning coming, and they know it. Next slide. This is again from Robert Baer. The Saudi government probably spends more per capita than any other country in the world on arms. It acknowledges only that it spends 13% of its GDP, but half of its revenue is earmarked for military. But listen, they're not spending military, they're not spending money on military to protect themselves primarily from foreign sources. It's primarily to protect themselves from their own people, from an uprising, and they're terrified of it, and they're terrified of Iran across the Persian Gulf. Next slide. If you want to read more about this, I actually do recommend, he's not a believer, and I think he uses some language. It's been a few years since I read this, but it's a great book. It really just deals with this whole tawdry underworld of the relationship between Washington. But you just read it and you just say, absolutely, this thing brings to light this whole paradigm that Saudi Arabia is the whore of the earth. I mean, it's crystal clear, and it's powerful to see it coming from someone who has no grid for the biblical side of this. He's just analyzing it from a political perspective. Next slide. The beast will hate the harlot, make her desolate and naked, eat her flesh, and burn her with fire. The day is coming when the coming Islamic empire will turn on the harlot. You see, she is going to be confronted and killed by the monster that she has created. Okay, for the past 50 years, the Saudis have spread Wahhabism, radical Islam throughout the earth, and the day is coming when that beast that she created will turn on her and devour her. Next slide. Have the nations of the earth felt the wrath of her false religion? Next slide. It says the nations of the earth were drunk on the wrath of her fornication. The wrath of her fornication. And again, Saudi Arabia is the financier. They are the financiers of radical Islam throughout the world. They pay off the Americans. They pay off the jihadists. That's where the money's coming from. Next slide. For all the nations have drunk the wine of the wrath of her fornication. Next.
I don't know what.
Is Saudi Arabia a rabid consumer? Saudi Arabia produces one thing, actually two things, radical Islam and oil. Other than that, it's a desert. Everything they have, they buy. Everything they have, they import. I have an associate was telling the story of how years back he went to Saudi Arabia, and he was just blown away. He's like, you know, they have these nice cars, these Mercedes, and they drive them, and they don't change the oil. And the engine seizes up, they pull it over on the side of the road, and they leave it there and just get a new car. You know, it's just a different mentality. But when you look at the specific items that are really delineated in Revelation 18, they're all actually things that Saudi Arabia buys. You know, it's gold and this and that and the other thing. And it even says, in the souls of men, slaves. And Saudi Arabia does buy slaves. You know, all of the Saudi royals, you know, the stories are just, they go on and on about their harems and all of the women that they buy and purchase. There's this story that I read about years ago. There was a group called Americans Against the Sawduction of Washington, and it was primarily made up of parents whose children had been kidnapped and smuggled to Saudi Arabia as sex slaves. And one of the stories that came out of this was this gal, and I can't remember her name, but she was one of these early child stars, and she was on you know, one of these morning talk shows, and they said she had like kind of gone through drugs and all these things. She was kind of recounting her life as a child star, and they said, well, what was the scariest thing that ever happened to you? She told the story. She said, you know, one time when I was about 14 years old, I kept getting these huge bouquets of flowers coming to my my office or whatever, day after day for like a week or 2 weeks, and we had no idea. They were just massive. I had no idea where they were from. Finally, after about 2 weeks, there was a card with an invitation to a party in New York City. And so I wanted to see what this was about. 14 years old, I have no idea where her parents were. She goes to this very swanky condo, and she said she opened the doors, and it was just this, like, you know, gilt paradise, just some like ridiculously luxurious condo, and there's all these young models, and you know, and she can't, what in the world, she doesn't, no one even really knows whose place it is. And she starts chatting with this guy. He was an Italian guy who was a chef at this, and he recognized her because she was a fairly well-known actress at the time. And she said, what in the world is this? And they were striking up a conversation. He said, listen, he said, this house is owned, this condominium is owned by some Saudi royal. And he said, and all of the food, you're going to be drugged. You're all going to go to sleep, and you're going to be flown out of the country, you know, via helicopter or whatever, or flown from here to a helicopter. And that, he said, just go out the back door and run. When you get to the bottom of the stairs, run. And she's like, you kidding me? You know, so she gets to the bottom of the stairs. She opens, there's a couple of guards there, but somehow she runs off. This is a story she tells. You read the stories from these parents, and you know, it's not something that I've investigated deeply, but you've probably seen the old movie Not Without My Daughter. The stories of women going to Saudi Arabia, meeting the swarthy Middle Eastern doctor, you know, young med student. They fall in love, they go there, and they want to leave. They have kids. You're not going anywhere. You don't have a driver's license, and the U.S. government will do nothing about it. They will do nothing to try to get them out of there, and they become slaves for the rest of their lives. They can't leave the country, and, you know, this is abundant. And it says they purchase, they deal. One of their wares is the souls of men and slaves. And there's not many countries in the world where it exists on that level. Next slide. Saudi Arabia represent the greatest false religion that has ever existed. Next slide. Here you have the heart of Saudi Arabia, the spiritual capital of Saudi Arabia. This is Mecca. Again, just to put this in context, it's 1.5 billion Muslims every day bow and pray to that little black cube, that little black shrine in the middle of Mecca, in the middle of the Al-Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary, as they call it, in the middle of Mecca. Not a single non-Muslim is technically allowed to enter that city. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Every year they make pilgrimage after the tradition of the pagans of ancient times. They encircle the cube, the Kaaba as it's called. Next slide. And embedded on the corner of the cube is the black stone. And the black stone, part of the pilgrimage is that you're supposed to rub the stone and kiss it and touch it, and supposedly when you do that, your sins up until that point in your life are absorbed. And they say, there's an Islamic tradition that says, there was a day when that stone was as white as milk, but it has absorbed the sins of so many people that it has become black. This is what Muslims say. So, in place of the blood of Christ, there is a black stone. Next slide. They kiss it, you know, this is sitting on the corner of the cube. Now, I'm not going to get into it in great detail, but essentially, when you look at the historical evidence surrounding this thing, in ancient times in the Middle East, you had these, it makes reference to it in the book of Acts. They're all upset and they say, great is, you know, Diana in Ephesus, or is it Artemis? They were interchangeable. Artemis, Diana. She was, again, sort of the fertility goddess. And they said, whose image fell from heaven? Whose image fell from heaven? And historical records say that the head of Diana was made from a black meteorite. It was a rock that fell from heaven, and her head was carved out of this black rock. Okay, so throughout the Middle East, you have these idols of these fertility goddesses whose image was carved out of black rocks that fell from heaven. And here you have this pagan shrine, and ultimately the encasement around the black rock is shaped like a female organ. And they all come up and they kiss it, and they do all these things, and they believe that it forgives their sins. And there's an Islamic tradition that says, I have no idea why we do this, other than I saw Muhammad do it, and since he did it, we do it. Other than that, we have no idea why we do it. Next slide. There's Khalid Mashal, the leader of Hamas. Next slide. I actually just saw that one right there was there, but some years ago there was refurbishments, and they brought in that new one. There was an old bronze encasement that went around it, that they have it in Istanbul, in a Sultanahmet Palace museum that they have there. This has been, you know, this image has been there for, 1,400 years. Again, throughout the Middle East, they worshipped these fertility goddesses. They worshipped these various war and moon astral deities. You know, they worship the moon and the sun. The God of Islam, the religion of Islam today, still bears the traces and the continuity between the ancient pagan religions of the Middle East. It's still there. Mecca is the capital of world idolatry. KAEC, King Abdullah Economic City. Again, many of you have heard about Dubai. You've seen pictures of Dubai. Next slide. Saudi Arabia is also building a city. They call it King Abdullah Economic City. Like Dubai, that burst forth out of nowhere overnight, this great city. Saudi Arabia has now also, for the past several years, been working on a new city. And it's going to sit just sort of down the coast from Mecca, essentially creating sort of a megalopolis with trains and buses moving people from KEC to Mecca and so forth, and creating this sort of economic and residential paradise right on the coast. Next slide. The construction site called Saudi Arabia. There's a picture of the island that they are building, and they're calling it Economic Island. Next slide. They're hoping to make KAEC completely surpass Dubai in terms of its ability to be the premier shipping and economic capital of the Middle East. They're moving in that direction. Next slide. There's another picture of, again, artistic portrayal of what they're hoping to make this thing. Next slide. There's a picture of the world's largest building, again, Khalifa Tower in Dubai. Now, for context, the next slide, it is twice as tall as the World Trade Center. You can see there's some of the world's tallest buildings. And over there on the far right is the World Trade Center. The building that was just completed is twice as tall. Okay, twice as tall as the World Trade Centers. Next slide. This is the tower that Prince Al-Walid bin Talal is planning on now building in Jeddah. Twice as tall as Khalifa Towers and a heck of a lot bigger. Okay? Compare that. Look down there at the World Trade Center, and then you see this building, and that's the one that they want to build in Jeddah. Now, next slide. The Tower of Babel. You know, is there any measure of prophetic significance here? I think it's striking. You know, I mean, yes, it's not, I want to be careful not to read too much into it, but absolutely, in the heart of the Middle East, in the very location where mankind tried to build a tower to heaven, today they're using their oil money to flaunt their greatness in Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia is continuing to gradually rise as the economic powerhouse of the Middle East. Next slide. And on her forehead a name was written, Mystery, Babylon the Great, the mother of all harlots and the abominations of all the earth. Amen.
There we have it, folks. Just an outstanding video there. Joe Richardson and this Saudi Arabia being the harlot of Babylon. I have a on my YouTube channel. You guys will see it. USMC 9176. You will see there's a video there of the actual building that they're building in Jeddah as we speak. And they modified it a little bit. It doesn't look like it originally did, but it talks about it on there. But it's still huge, way bigger than Khalifa Towers in Dubai. And it's very significant that, I mean, it's just like you're looking at the Tower of Babel. And it's quite amazing to see this stuff going on. So it's just awesome to see that we're living in the time of Christ, you know, Christ's return. And if you don't believe that, well, then you must be living in a cocoon. You know, the evidence is overwhelming as to where the Antichrist is coming out of Saudi Arabia, not Rome, not the heart of Babylon. I actually also have a get this for you. I actually have this article that I'll be going over later today. I'll be doing a video on this from the Tedland Daily. Awesome article entitled Vatican as the Harlot of Babylon Debunked. And that's by Theodore Schubot. And you know, he comes on our Bible studies. But he did an amazing article here. I'm going to read this in a video. And I'm going to try to forward these over to the churches, to their Facebook pages, and whatever pages they have out there I could send it to. And, you know, we got to wake our churches up, folks. We got to let people know what's going on. It is up to you. It is up to you to hold those who are teaching in the Scriptures accountable to the Scriptures themselves. Because when you go to heaven, or when you're being judged by Christ, He's not going to accept, oh, well, this is what my pastor taught me, and this is what this person taught me. He's going to say, Why didn't you study for yourself? And what are you going to say? You know, you need to be found worthy. You do. And no one can stand for you at that time. I can't, Waleed Shubak can't, Theodore Shubak can't, none of your pastors can, none of these so-called Bible experts or scholars can. It's just you in Christ, and you better know what to say. You better be able to at least say, hey, you know, I believed in you, and it showed in what I did. Or you say, I believe in you, and he'll say, well, you didn't act like you did. You know, we don't have room for you here. Sorry. I believe our God is a God of doers. He wants doers to, you know, to enter His kingdom. Those that do His will. If you're doing things that are against His will, especially if you're willfully doing it, especially if you know what His will is and you choose to do opposite of it, you're in some serious trouble. And if you've been warned, and this is a warning to you, you're going up against the Catholic Church saying that the Antichrist, those are followers of Christ, the Catholic Church, our brothers and sisters. Christians and Catholics are the same. You people need to get that through your head. We're the same. We're on the same team. There's theological issues, sure, but it's not like Mormons and Jehovah's Witnesses. Catholics are not like them. Catholicism is not a cult. Okay? You need to understand, yes, there are things within their theology that we can work through, but there's things in the evangelical Protestant movement as well that are questionable considering theology. I'm a perfect example of that because I've been kicked out for raising the questions. Kicked out. Have you heard of people getting kicked out? You probably haven't, because they're just like the government and they hush everything up like it doesn't happen. This stuff, you saw a great video, great information. Take advantage of it. Share this with others. It'll be on my YouTube channel pretty soon here, USMC 9176 or Chris G. Go to YouTube, put that in, and you can find it. All right, I'm going to title it, it'll give it a new name. I'm going to title it June 25th, Google Hangout Google On Air Hangout. That's what I'm going to entitle it. June 25th, 2013, Google On Air Hangout. So you want to get it, go to USMC 9176 or just put in the title. It'll be 6/25/13, Google On Air Hangout. Okay? God bless you all. I hope that this has helped you, and I want to try to do a lot more of these. I want to do one every day, but I'm not going to always be able to every day. But if you get a chance, go to Google Plus or plusgoogle.com, plusgoogle.com, and go to the, if you don't have an account, get one. They're free. Don't worry about the government listening to you. If they're listening to you, good. They need to hear this stuff, okay? Go to Google, get an account. If you don't have an account, go to the Google On-Air Hangouts, okay? And you could see whoever's doing an on-air hangout at that moment. And I'll try to be doing them right around the 3 o'clock, anywhere from 12 noon to 3 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. If you get a chance during those hours, try to pop in Google On-Air Hangouts and see if I'm on. Chances are I will be, but the titles will be something to the effect of, if I'm playing a video or something, maybe I should have a significant thing for you. I'll put infidel, okay? Infidel. From now on my Google Hangouts, I will start the title with infidel and whatever I'm doing, okay? So if you see infidel on there, it's me. Okay, I'm on Facebook under Marine Veteran. I'm on Google under Marine Veteran. I'm on Twitter under defend_the_USA. All capitals on USA. Defend is capital D, and then spell out the rest of the word defend. With a capital D, and then an underscore, and then the, not capital, underscore again, and then capital USA. Okay, that's on Twitter. I don't really do much communicating with others on Twitter. I use that to promote the videos that I put out, stuff like that. I'm also, again, on YouTube under USMC 9176 or Chris G is my channel. Either one of those should come up, bring the channel up. USMC 9176 should pull it up really quick. But that's it. God bless you all, and my prayer is that all of you will help in getting our churches back. Our churches back focused on Scripture, and that way we can go gain our country back in with bigger numbers. We could influence our country to come to the aid of Israel and persecuted Christians around the world. Okay, God bless, and I will